This is part 2 of our coverage of every cancelled Nintendo 64 DD game. Let's get straight back into it. After rare success with the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, they started making a new game for Super Nintendo codenamed Project Dream, also known as Dream Land of Giants. Led by Rare co-founder Tim Stamper, Dream was an action RPG starring a boy named Edson and his dog Dinger, who cross swords with pirates on the hunt for a magic potion that'll make their ships fly. Edson and his girlfriend have to flee the pirates' wrath, and that's how the story gets going, with fantastical elements like giants and dinosaurs thrown in for good measure. I started at Rare in October 1995, composer Grant Kirkhope recalled. I was shown Dream running on the SNES and was blown away. It looked beautiful and was obviously going to be a big step up from Donkey Kong Country. The console generation was coming to a close, so development moved to the 64 DD. According to a couple devs we talked to, the DD was chosen over the standard N64 for its extra storage, rather than any DD-specific features. At this point, Dream dropped the fantasy feel in favor of a golden age of piracy theme, to avoid seeming childish. Over 100 tracks of music were made, some of which you're hearing now. After a while, Stamper felt the boy hero wasn't working in this more mature world and wanted him swapped out with an animal. So they replaced him with a rabbit, then a bear who up until that point had been a minor side character. Later, the Dream team saw an early build of Mario 64 and thought, this looks more fun than what we're doing, let's change Dream into a Mario-style platformer instead. If you haven't pieced it together yet, the bear protagonist was named Banjo, and 16 months later it was released as a little game called Banjo-Kazooie. It's interesting to note, the game actually spent longer in development as Dream than it did as Banjo. Tim Stamper occasionally teases pieces from his collection, and last year he posted this on Twitter.
Arr, so it's true then. The Nintendo 64 treasure does exist after all. Ha 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 ha! It's mine, all mine!
That's Captain Blackeye, leader of the pirate antagonists. He later shows up in Banjo-Tooie, where he complains that a bear stole his glory, as a backhanded nod to Project Dream. Zoom in on Stamper's video and you can see the dev cart says latest version of Dream 64, dated November 96. Supposedly, it's the only copy that still exists. Fans begged him to release it to the public, but he's unlikely to ever do so. He just likes flaunting his treasures. Wall Street was announced in '99 and designed around the DD's internet connection and displayed stock prices updating in real time. Though to be clear, it wasn't software for investing, just a simulation for entertainment. Now some of you all are probably thinking, hurry up and get to the games we actually care about, like Mario and Zelda. That's pretty much exactly what Japanese press said in '99, to which Nintendo president Yamauchi's response was, quote, Wall Street is the 64 DD's Mario and Zelda. He called it the disk drive's killer app. Virtually zero info was ever published in English. No one even knows who was making it. We managed to find out in some old Japanese magazines. Turns out it was Recruit Co., who was Nintendo's partner and co-owners in Marigal and RanNet. In one interview we found, RanNet's president said, when we give away the free demo, people are going to be surprised. Some people will probably get addicted to it. It's a completely new financial simulation game that's very different from menu-based games of the past. It's not just buying stocks and making money, it's in 3D. When I saw it, I was amazed at the graphics. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen before. He went on to say that after the Super Mario Club examined Wall Street, it was their most anticipated DD game. In another interview, RanNet said it was aimed at adults, but gameplay details were always kept secret. Were we going to be pumping, dumping, and bankrupting entire countries? Maybe exploring New York's financial district and completing missions? Unfortunately, it seems we'll never find out, since the disk drive flopped soon after, at which point Wall Street and a ton of other projects got canned. Fans never got to see so much as a single screenshot. Long before it turned into Ocarina of Time, Zelda 64 was announced at Space World 95 and developed specifically for the 64 DD. Miyamoto had big plans for disc's rewritable storage, though he was pretty guarded about the specifics. When pressed for details, he told interviewers, quote, that part is particularly top secret. One implementation was made public though, the persistent world idea. Link's actions would forever impact Hyrule, with every step in the desert leaving a permanent footprint. A revolutionary achievement for the time, only possible thanks to the DD disk's 38 megabytes of writable storage. Again, Sony memory cards could only store 1/8 of a megabyte, meaning DD games could save 300 times more than PlayStation games. Records from the DD days show locations and characters that didn't make it into the final game, most famously the Triforce Room and the NPC Aria. Another DD difference was that Sage medallions were originally magic medallions, one for fire, wind, darkness, light, and so on, that Link could then combine with arrows. According to game system director Eiji Aonuma, we were going to integrate some actions, some plot threads, and some puzzles making use of those magic medallions, but we came to the conclusion that other already existing items, like fire arrows, could be an equal substitute. A few dungeons changed as well. The Wind Temple became the Forest Temple, and the Ice Temple became the Water Temple. One dungeon got cut entirely, with Aonuma saying, "We originally had 3 temples for young Link to conquer, 3 for adult Link to conquer, and 3 for him to learn a spell in, for a total of 9. But we cut one." Those were mostly typical development cuts, same as any other game. But the real problem was Link's inability to move properly. 3D Systems director Yoshiaki Koizumi made about 500 animations for Link, running, jumping, swinging his sword up, down, etc. On a DD floppy, sometimes it'd take time to load a specific animation. "I can't move my Link on the Nintendo 64 DD, Koizumi complained. Cartridges don't have any moving mechanical parts, but discs do, unfortunately, so they had no choice but to switch development over to the standard N64. At the April 97 Tokyo Game Show, Miyamoto got up on stage and proclaimed Zelda's gonna be on cartridge. The audience murmured. "I want to prioritize Link's movements more than the writable storage a disc allows, so we're switching to cartridge. It'll release in the fall." Later, it was revealed Zelda wasn't just coming to a cart, it was a 32 megabyte cart, the biggest ever released at the time. But it was only half the size of a DD disc, and lacked rewritability, so there'd be no persistent world to remember Link's actions, or any of the other features Miyamoto kept secret. The Zelda team kept pouring more and more content into the cart, so much so that the fall 97 release date gradually slipped all the way to November 1998. Miyamoto didn't want to stop, but they needed those holiday sales, and a lot of ideas got axed as a result. Like Keipora Gebora having multiple personalities. "We wanted to do that," Miyamoto lamented, but wouldn't have had it ready in time for Christmas. "There were a lot of ideas we couldn't add in, like the hug bed. When Link gets in his bed, it suddenly wrap around him. We didn't have enough time to put that in either." He also felt Hyrule was too empty, without much moving around in it, or information to obtain. Ultimately, Miyamoto said he was 90% satisfied with how Ocarina turned out. But with 2 more months, he could have hit 100. He also said it'd be cool if the game saved after beating Ganon, letting you explore a Hyrule at peace. But adding a 3rd version of Hyrule would have required 20% more space, which the cartridge just didn't have. After Zelda switched to carts, but before release, Miyamoto drew up a plan. Launch Ocarina of Time near Christmas, then a 64 DD disc later, with ideas he couldn't fit in the cart. The disc was called Ura Zelda, which translates to Another Zelda or Zelda's Flip Side, an expansion set in the same old Hyrule, but different this time. Miyamoto said there'd be new areas and dungeons, and compared it to the New Game Plus in the original Legend of Zelda, where after beating the game, the difficulty increases, dungeons change locations, heart containers, shops, and items are relocated, and so on. Zelda 1's New Game Plus doesn't have a name in-game. English speakers usually call it Second Quest, but in Japan it's often referred to as Ura Zelda. And that's what this new Ura Zelda was going to be, a continuation of that old tradition, but more ambitious. Fan hype was through the roof, with gamers desperate to see how the greatest game of all time could be made even better with a future tech expansion. Miyamoto said there'd be, quote, "the random element. Every time you go into a dungeon, the composition will be different. For example, if a treasure chest was in a certain place the first time you entered a dungeon, it won't be there next time, it'll be somewhere else." And though he was explicit that we couldn't build our own dungeons, we would be able to, quote, "download new dungeons and share data with other players." He later said potentially hundreds of dungeons. In one particularly mysterious interview, Miyamoto teased, "We've already talked about a network Zelda as an interesting idea. The assistance of other players in the network could motivate a player's active participation, instead of the traps or secrets that I create." We asked Giles Goddard, an Ocarina dev who sat next to Miyamoto when he said that, if Nintendo actually worked on that network Zelda.
"Instead of the traps or secrets that I create. Do you recall any specifics regarding work on this network Zelda that have never made their way into a finished Zelda game?"
Yes.
Okay.
And I want to stay alive, so I'm not going to say what.
It seems whatever those online features were, they're still a tightly held secret. If this all sounds familiar, it's because we did an Ura Zelda deep dive a couple years ago. In today's video, we're covering dozens of games, so you're just getting the Ura cliff notes. If you want every detail, go watch that previous video after this one. But to wrap it up, by the time Ocarina came out a couple years later, Miyamoto had scrapped all those ideas and decided Ura would focus only on the dungeons. But Aonuma didn't want to do that because you couldn't call something like that a, quote, new game, in his opinion. So he and Miyamoto struck a bargain. If his team could make a full game for 64DD in just 1 year, they wouldn't have to do Ura Zelda. And thus, most of the team started a new project called Zelda Gaiden, while a skeleton crew stayed behind to work on Ura. They tried to do more, but in the end, all they got finished was slightly remixing the dungeons. At this point, Ocarina's expansion was completely neutered compared to its original version, and even less ambitious than Zelda 1's Ura. Zelda Gaiden translates to Zelda Side Story, a title Miyamoto liked so much he considered making it the official name of the game. His original idea was a direct sequel set in a peaceful post-Ganon Hyrule, with Link investigating some sort of incident, quote, like a detective game. But Aonuma's team went in a different direction, ultimately leading to Majora's Mask. It's unclear if it was ever planned to take advantage of any of the DD's unique features, like the real-time clock, online connection, or mass rewritable storage. There's a few websites claiming the clock would have been used, which sounds plausible considering Majora's focus on time, and that the game's length was originally 1 week instead of 3 days. Having in-game time reflect real-time makes some intuitive sense, instead of 1 in-game hour passing in under a minute, but we've never seen any primary sources supporting these claims. The only thing we could find was Miyamoto literally mumbling to himself that maybe players would be able to design their own masks with the Game Boy camera and Mario Artist. But according to our 64DD consultant LuigiBlood, the release version had its liblio completely removed. That's the internal library code that manages the 64DD. In other words, any info on DD-specific features got erased. So rumors and mumbling aside, it seems the only part of the disk drive Majora was ever meant to use was the memory expansion pack. A lot of you all remember it as just that thing you had to stick in your N64 to play more Zelda, but originally it was part of the 64DD bundle. Now's probably a good time to explain what that bundle was and how it released. You see, the 64DD was never sold in stores like standard N64s, it was mail order only, and it didn't have a price exactly, more like a subscription. You had to sign up for a 1-year plan paying 2,500 yen a month, equivalent to $23 US, plus a one-time $14 shipping fee. So in total, you're paying 290 USD for the full bundle. In return, you get a 64DD, a mouse, and memory expansion pack along with 7 games, Doshin the Giant, SimCity 64, the F-Zero X expansion kit, and all 4 Mario Artists. You also get the RANnet disc, cable, and modem cartridge for connecting to the internet. So really not a bad deal for under 300 bucks. Most of that bundle you get at launch, but some would trickle in over the next few months. After the first year, it cost $14 a month if you wanted to continue your RANnet internet service, for stuff like downloads, online games, and so on. The initial bundle was limited to 100,000 customers, and Nintendo was going to make more after they sold out. Pre-orders opened November 99, with deliveries arriving early December. Nintendo expected to sell 500,000 units in the first year, but only 15,000 people bought in. So the DD was deemed a failure. Only 2 more games ever released, Japan Pro Golf Tour 64 and Doshin the Giant, Tinkling Toddler Liberation Front. Both came out in May 2000, priced at $30 each. In October, Nintendo announced RANnet was being discontinued, at which point the disk drive was officially dead. Even the Virtual Boy, an objectively worse piece of hardware, managed to sell more units, get more games, and hold on longer till death. And well, that's pretty much all you need to know about the 64 add-ons distribution. If you want to hear more about the 9 games that did release, GameSack's got a great video covering them all. Check it out when you're done here. But yeah, the memory expansion pack. It doubled memory from 4 megabytes to 8, or in other words, it enabled the game to do more all at once. For Majora's Mask, that mostly came down to NPC movements and animations. That seemed to be the only piece of the 64DD it ever made use of. By early 2000, the disk drive was already on its deathbed, so they released Majora on a cartridge that required the expansion pack as a separate $30 purchase. The game itself cost $60, though it probably would have sold for half that if it stayed on disc. Likewise, Zelda probably would have sold for around $20, since that's what the F-Zero expansion cost if you bought it outside of the bundle. Now turning attention back to Zelda. After the Skeleton Crew finished remixing the dungeons, Nintendo stuck the game in a vault for a few years, not sure what to do with it. They debated putting it on cartridge like they did with Majora, but ultimately they put it on a GameCube disc and made it a pre-order bonus for Wind Waker. Thanks to that, 500,000 fans paid up for pre-orders and made Wind Waker the most pre-ordered game of all time in 2003. In English they called it Master Quest, but in Japanese it's still Zelda. A decade later, when Ocarina came to 3DS, it released with a new version of Zelda, a little closer to the original version.
知る人ぞ知るもう一つの時のオカリナ、通称裏ゼルダ。
It's got remixed dungeons, of course, but enemies also deal double damage, and the entirety of Hyrule is mirrored left to right. The 3DS version also has a boss rush hidden in Link's bed, seemingly a callback to the hug bed Miyamoto wanted to implement all those years ago. The rest of Zelda, with its randomization, downloadable dungeons, and network abilities, all became little more than unused ideas and unfinished programming. Running in real time at Space World 96, Rev Limit was one of the earliest third-party disc games shown publicly. Another 3 years of development, and it was pretty far along, set to become the DD's premier racing title. With the power of the 64DD, players could customize Japanese supercars and tracks and race against friends online. According to Japanese magazines, for folks who were more into tuning than racing, there was also going to be a director mode, letting you be more of a manager and leave the driving itself to a professional. Unfortunately, the game eventually downgraded to a standard N64 cartridge, then canned outright when the devs at Seta ran into financial troubles. Rev Limit was originally planned to release on DD and as an arcade cabinet, kinda like F-Zero AX did years later. But Rev Limit Arcade got cancelled too. A prototype N64 cart from late in development was listed on Yahoo Auctions in 2016 and purchased by Japanese YouTuber Retro Game TV. He uploaded about 10 minutes of video, but even now, 8 years later, hasn't dumped the game so anyone else can play it. Generally speaking, Japanese fans aren't as willing to dump ROMs as their Western counterparts, so unless another copy pops up, DD fans will probably never get to experience Rev Limit for themselves. The next long-lost game on our list is an action-packed rail-shooting homage to Star Fox and Space Harrier. Wait, that's no Lost 64 DD game. It's a game you can play right now, and it's the sponsor of today's video, X-Zodiac. Forgive us, its graphics are just too convincing. X-Zodiac's low-poly aesthetic captures that 90s charm, but lets loose with a silky smooth frame rate. Set in the Sanzaru star system, the game's worlds are plagued by an intergalactic terrorist group called Zodiac, and it's your job to take them down. X-Zodiac has 9 main levels, all with major boss battles against terrorist agents, and the devs plan on adding at least 6 more levels in the future. There's also 6 bonus levels, a jamming 16-bit style soundtrack, and of course, barrel rolls. We've had a ton of fun playing X-Zodiac for this video, and we're not alone. It's got overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. X-Zodiac can be yours for just $10 on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Check it out on Steam Early Access using the link in the description below. And if you're feeling generous, consider adding it to your wish list. It really helps indie games like this get discovered by new players. Now, let's get back to the real 64 DD games.
All was peaceful until the Dark Riders came and destroyed our village. Many were cut down where they stood, and those who took up arms were slain or dragged away to become slaves, or worse.
If you were alive in the 90s, Diablo is a game that needs no introduction. Blizzard Entertainment's groundbreaking action RPG sold millions on PC, racked up review scores in the 9s and 10s, and is widely considered one of the greatest games of the decade. Diablo kicks off with the protagonist arriving in Tristam, a small town overwhelmed by the forces of evil. The player makes his way through churches, catacombs, caves, and ultimately hell itself to kill the source of the chaos, Diablo. In '97, Nintendo bought the rights to publish the M-rated adventure on their own console, presumably with the disk drive in mind, since RandNet talked about its online multiplayer. When Japanese press said the DD wouldn't have enough games, RandNet president Kayama dismissed their concerns, saying, "I'm not worried. There are people satisfied to play one great game all the time. Some only need Diablo and nothing else. For 64 DD, it'll be enough if people see we have at least one title they can't live without." In context, he meant at least one game for different kinds of gamers, and went on to say for others, Wall Street would be the one game for them. But you get the idea. The strategy was quality over quantity. Unfortunately, Diablo never came out, though it's worth noting that Nintendo did publish StarCraft, another PC hit from Blizzard, as an N64 cartridge a year after that interview when the DD was pretty much already dead. A lot of cutscenes and voice acting had to be cut, so it fit on a 32 megabyte cartridge. But Blizzard did make some exclusive content for StarCraft 64, including a secret new story mission, and it would have been awesome if Diablo had gotten the same treatment, especially on the disk drive where so many cuts wouldn't be necessary. Sometimes called the worst game of all time, Superman 64 was originally planned to get a disc expansion after its summer '99 cartridge release. Soup was terrible, but actually sold pretty well, peaking at number 3 on the sales charts. So an expansion made sense financially. The game's developers at Titus also hoped to launch an expansion for Automobili Lamborghini, which was actually a half-decent game, unlike Superman. According to Titus, the disc was going to add new tracks, cars, environments, and additional features. They also announced one more game that they were going to release on 64 with later expansion, the action RPG Quest for Camelot, based on the animated movie of the same name. Quest for Camelot 64 and its expansion both got cancelled after the film flopped at the box office and never left early planning stages, though Titus did still make a Game Boy Color version. It was basically a crappy Zelda clone with review scores averaging 4 out of 10. So even though 3 Titus discs did get cancelled, we probably didn't miss out on much, if you know what I mean. We've mentioned a few expansions so far, and we've got more coming up, so now's probably a good time to explain how they worked. Most 64 DD games were standalone. You just stick the disc in and you're off to the races, but some were expansions like F-Zero. You put the F-Zero X cartridge in the N64 and then insert the disc to add more features to the base game. In F-Zero's case, that meant a dozen more tracks, a car creator, track editor, and the ability to save 100 custom tracks to disk, and combine them into custom cups. Oh, and new music. Check it out. This one's a remix of Mario Kart Rainbow Road. Quite a few expansions were announced, but F-Zero is the only one that ever released. And as of the making of this video, only one more is leaked online, which we'll get to later. One last thing about expansions, they require hooks in the cartridge they're expanding. Hooks are basically lines of code that say this cartridge will get an expansion. What's weird though is that Superman 64 and Automobili Lamborghini don't have any hooks, meaning it would have been impossible to give them expansions. Possibly sometime after announcing Superman and Lambo's expansion, but before the carts came out, Titus decided to quietly cancel their expansions, then deleted the hooks to save cartridge space. Probably not though, since hooks only take up a few dozen kilobytes, which is basically nothing. It's more likely that Titus didn't know how expansions worked and were too incompetent to know they needed hooks in the first place. Resident Evil 0. Capcom started planning a Resident Evil prequel right around the time Nintendo announced the 64DD. But after seeing the disk drive's repeated delays and specs, Capcom decided to make it for the N64 instead. We found a fortuitous story in an old Japanese magazine where an interviewer asked Miyamoto why Ocarina of Time's Castle Town has fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds when the rest of the game is behind view in full 3D. Miyamoto explained, "This is a sample of how you can do more on N64. You could call it PR aimed at third parties." Then he laughed and said, "Want to make Resident Evil on it, Mr. Okamoto?" Okamoto's a Capcom producer, and turns out he did end up making a Resident Evil for N64. But after a couple years, the console generation was almost over, so they shifted development over to the GameCube and released in 2002. The 64-bit version had some significant differences, like fast zombies, co-op multiplayer, and of course, the graphics and presentation.
Huh, I see. You're with Stars. You came from that chopper I saw, huh?
Series enthusiasts are dying to play the original, which is theoretically possible since it was at least 20% complete and playable demos were exhibited at the 2000 Tokyo Game Show. Unfortunately, as of this video, no one's come forward with one of those copies to dump online.
If our princess is at the keep, there are two ways to get there. The western path, or the northern passage.
Kaede, I'll go north. You follow them through the other way.
Understand.
Nintendo fans got to play Resident Evil 0 on GameCube, but they weren't so lucky when it came to Onimusha. In '97, Nintendo, Capcom, and Sega combined forces to fund a brand new studio called Flagship, and put Okamoto in charge. When that happened, Okamoto said, "I'm very interested in N64. PlayStation CD-ROM is merely a readable medium. It's obvious that the 64DD's writable feature is very attractive, and this feature will increase the fun of Nintendo games. I want to pursue this particular aspect of development. I don't know if it's possible or not, in regard to technical difficulties, but I have an idea for a ninja version of Resident Evil, in a ninja house full of booby traps and gimmicks." What he's describing later became the first Onimusha, which is essentially a feudal Japan-themed Resident Evil.
Samanosuke, it's really you. Oh, I knew that you would come to save me.
It's got cheese, fixed cameras, tank controls, pre-rendered backgrounds, but instead of cops shooting zombies, it's samurai cutting down demons. A few months after that interview, Okamoto said, quote, "The N64? Of course we're doing it. It's still a secret, but we're starting development on one game for cartridge and one game for 64DD. Please wait and see." The way things turned out, he didn't end up releasing anything on Nintendo 64 or DD. But considering the timeline, those secret projects might have been Resident Evil 0 for N64 or Onimusha for DD. Over the next few years, Okamoto's Flagship made quite a few games for other Nintendo systems, like Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons, Four Swords, Minish Cap, and also worked on Resident Evil 4 and a few Kirby games. There's some conflicting accounts among different devs, but for whatever reason, Flagship started developing Onimusha for PlayStation, then upgraded to release on PS2 with an eventual port to Xbox and even PC in some regions, but never N64, DD, or GameCube. To this day, it's unknown exactly how Okamoto wanted to use the DD's read-write capabilities. Regardless, Onimusha went on to score 8s, 9s, and 10s, which naturally led to sequels and spin-offs. And though it'd be little solace for Nintendo fans back in the day, the original Onimusha did get remastered for Switch. So, if you're a Nintendo-only gamer, you can finally play it, but without the DD features Okamoto was so passionate about. Pokemon Stadium is a game that doesn't need to exist. Stadium's intro cutscene even calls itself POS version 1.0, and they ain't lying. We jest, but remember how upset fans got when Sword and Shield only had 400 Pokemon? Well, imagine a game with only 40 Pokemon. Stadium was originally announced as a launch title for the 64DD. In fact, previews show it fully playable in early '98. With a DD disc 64 megabytes, you could fit tons of data, and originally it was promoted as a sort of Pokemon bank. Trade your Game Boy monsters over and save them to disk. There's more than enough space to store them all. But the DD kept getting delayed, 5 times actually, and they were worried the Pokemon fad wasn't going to last forever. So Stadium got downgraded to regular old N64 onto a cartridge with just 40 Pokemon and only capable of banking 120. Stadium was content poor, and beyond the novelty of seeing a few dozen 3D Pokemon models, it didn't serve much purpose, which is why it never left Japan.
What? Unbelievable!
Some of y'all are probably thinking, I'm sure I played Stadium as a kid, what are you talking about, it never left Japan? Well, the game you played was actually Pokemon Stadium 2, but outside Japan, it was just called Pokemon Stadium. You played the second game. It's what the original disc game should have been, with 151 Pokemon, storage for 240 mons, minigames, and more. Stadium 2 was initially supposed to be a disc 2, actually. It was planned as an expansion, not a sequel. But by 1999, there was less and less reason for the N64DD to even exist. When Nintendo first dreamed it up, the 64 megabyte disc format had a lot of promise, because early in the console generation, they didn't know how to squeeze much storage onto a cartridge. Super Mario 64, for example, was only 8 megabytes. A couple years later, Pokemon Stadium was on a 16 megabyte cartridge. By the time Stadium 2 rolled around, they'd figured out how to fit 32 megabytes, and eventually all the way up to 64 megabytes. So as the add-on kept getting delayed further into the future, it became less and less relevant. Fun fact, to fit all 251 Pokemon, the next Stadium was one of only 3 games ever released on a 64 megabyte cartridge. It's Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver in Japan, but overseas they called it Pokemon Stadium 2, even though Pokemon Stadium 1 is really Stadium 2. A little confusing, but it's worth noting that Stadium 2's code supports a DD expansion of its own, which suggests Stadium Gold and Silver might have been intended as that expansion, which would mean all 3 stadiums were originally meant for 64DD before switching to cartridge. Fire Emblem Maiden of Darkness, also known as Fire Emblem 64, would have been the series' 6th entry. According to Miyamoto, progress was steady and on track for a late '98 launch. Only one screenshot was ever made public, years later in the Japan-only Fire Emblem 25th Anniversary book. The game would have been 3/4 view, as you might expect, visually a middle ground between the SNES and GameCube Fire Emblems. The Japanese book also includes some art for unused characters, like Taki, Lynette, Helen, Idun, and a few characters without names. The protagonist would have been Roy, who actually got into Smash Bros. Melee despite his debut in Fire Emblem 64 being cancelled. Roy got repurposed for future Fire Emblem games, but Fire Emblem 64's absence left him in the awkward position of fighting in Smash Bros. Before he appeared in his own franchise. Fire Emblem series creator Shozukaga said Fire Emblem 64 was too ambitious, then resigned from the company in autumn 2000, with the game publicly scrapped soon after. The next Fire Emblem actually released on SNES, an unusual step backwards considering the N64 was over 3 years old by then. Some elements of Fire Emblem 64 made it into later games, like the Binding Blade, but for the most part, all work on the DD game got thrown out. No ROM or even footage of Fire Emblem 64 has ever leaked online, but that Japanese book did include a page of in-game dialogue. We'll flash it up on screen if you want to read it. Consumers don't need to buy personal computers, they can get a 64DD instead. That was Nintendo's thinking when they teamed up with computer memory manufacturer Hagiwara Syscom, electronic makers DAT Japan and Tokyo Electron, and Fujifilm Co. to make Mario no Photopea. It's basically Photoshop wearing Mario as a skin suit, but even worse than it sounds, as Nintendo themselves didn't do much of the development. It released on cartridge in '98, and what a cartridge it was, just look at it. The slots on top are for smart media cards, so you could import photos from a '90s era digital camera. It was only released in Japan, so we've been showing you a fan translation, otherwise you'd have no idea what you're looking at. Nintendo announced a disc expansion would follow 6 months later to make use of the writable storage, basically just to let you save more pictures. Fast forward 6 months and the 64DD still wasn't out yet, and Mario no Photopea's expansion was never heard from again. Despite immense popularity in the 80s and 90s, the Far East of Eden RPG series has mostly stayed region-locked in Japan. Only one entry was ever localized in English, and that was a fighting game spin-off on Neo Geo. Not long after, Hudson Soft announced a return to the turn-based format with Far East of Eden Oriental Blue for 64DD. But thanks to the add-ons delays and eventually piss-poor sales, Oriental Blue found itself quietly cancelled. In 2003, a game with the same name released on Game Boy Advance in Japan. In short, it's set in a world where Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, and Thailand-inspired cultures coexist, and the hero, he or she, your choice, has to restore peace after a spirit-stealing orb corrupts a nearby castle town. It mostly scored 8 out of 10s, and got enough love for admirers to craft an English fan translation. But according to its director, the GBA game was nothing like the earlier disk drive project, after they had gone back to the drawing board and had to, quote, start over from scratch. The original was canned, as far as we can tell, before a single screenshot or any details were ever released aside from the title itself. And thus, Far East of Eden, Oriental Blue remains one of the disk drive's most enigmatic RPGs, which probably would have turned out pretty good. We keep saying games got cancelled or downgraded to cart because of the DD's repeated delays. But why was it delayed? The original N64 launched in June '96 with 3 games, Mario, Shogi, and Pilot Wings. The disk drive wasn't delayed because Nintendo couldn't figure out the hardware. As a matter of fact, it was finished in May '97 and announced to release at the end of the year. According to Miyamoto, there'd be 5 launch titles: Pokemon Stadium, Mother 3, SimCity 64, Mario Artist, and 1 game they were keeping secret. That's a pretty good lineup. Unfortunately, Mother 3, which was promoted as the must-haviest of the 5, fell into development hell. Mario Artist wasn't ready either, and wouldn't be for over a year. And we're not sure what secret game Miyamoto was teasing, but it doesn't appear it was ever finished. So all they really had for launch was SimCity and a half-assed Pokemon Stadium, and thus nothing system-defining like Mario had been to the core console. So Nintendo pushed back the disk drive's release a few months to March 1998, but the situation didn't improve, so they pushed it back again, to June '98, then late '98, then June '99, and finally a 5th and final delay to December 1999. At this point, third-party studios had lost enthusiasm for the add-on, and PlayStation 2 was only 3 months away. Nintendo knew they were screwed. Maybe if Mother 3 had been done on time, or Super Mario 64 2, or Zelda, if anything of substance was ready in '97 or '98, the disk drive could have taken off. But they just couldn't put together a good launch lineup till it was too late, and that's why the 64DD was dead on arrival. Tonic Trouble was a 3D platformer sharing a lot of DNA with Rayman 2. Same concept creator, composer, same voice actor for the lead, and both released by Ubisoft in 1999. Tonic Trouble came out first though, starring an alien named Ed who accidentally spills some troublesome tonic on Earth, mutating the entire planet. Then he's got to return things back to normal. That's basically the plot. Gameplay-wise, it's a pretty typical 90s platformer. It's not on Wikipedia's big 64DD list, but Ubisoft did acquire a DD dev kit and said Tonic would get a disc expansion, possibly to include a 4-player split-screen co-op. But they ended up scrapping it before the cartridge was even out yet because of, you guessed it, Ubisoft's frustration with the DD's constant delays. The cartridge release was later panned by critics who gave it mostly 5s, though the game still managed to sell over 1 million copies despite the weak reviews. A sequel was briefly in the works, but that fizzled out too, ultimately leaving Ed's legacy as little more than Rayman's forgotten little brother. One of the more unique concepts from a third party was Super Real Island, also known as Desert Island 64. Its story would have seen you shipwrecked on a deserted island with no knowledge of the native inhabitants or wildlife. You'd farm, raise livestock, fight off predators, and build a civilization from scratch. As the island grows, life evolves, friendly and unfriendly, so the players got to bring nature to heel. Sounds like a cool idea, but apparently it wasn't very impressive in practice. The game reportedly only reached 20% completion. Then the developers at Imagineer pitched gameplay to European publishers, none of which were interested. Imagineer is best known for making Quest 64, fondly remembered by some as the first RPG for N64, 2 years into its life cycle. But Quest 64's review scores averaged about 5 out of 10. Desert Island 64 probably wasn't going to fare much better, and even magazine writers at the time said it would probably end up as a shipwreck of a game. That same team at Imagineer worked on another game tentatively titled Soul. Soul was an RPG in the, quote, traditional Japanese adventure style that would have had you exploring towns and landscapes and prioritize story and depth over graphics. No other info or images were ever made public, so it seems this project didn't get too far along either. Imagineer did manage to release Big Mountain 2000 though. Big Mountain 2000! They announced the skiing and snowboarding game was to be developed for 64DD, but just 6 months later, it was already out on cartridge. It only had 4 stages, and even Nintendo Power, who was typically generous to games on their own systems, only scored it in the 5s. IGN thought a disc version would provide better resolution and texture variety, but that didn't end up happening. Imagineer wasn't exactly an A or even B tier studio, so rather than dwell on Big Mountain 2000, we'll go ahead and skip ahead too. Dragon Quest is a massive franchise, bigger even than Final Fantasy. The first 6 Dragon Quests were exclusive to Nintendo consoles, and the 7th was slated for the 64 disc drive. a turn-based RPG that begins with your father bringing home a map he found on a fishing trip. It shows a world filled with continents, but the world in their time is just a small island in a vast ocean. The player and his growing party travel back in time to when those continents were still around, but they are facing crises threatening their survival, and only by resolving their problems can the continents reappear in the present. Dragon Quest VII was announced in 1996, but a year later Enix announced they were jumping ship and releasing on PlayStation instead. It's hard to overstate how big a blow this was for Nintendo. The game ended up going quadruple platinum in Japan alone, a huge win for PlayStation that only cast more doubt on Nintendo's position in the industry. And what made it even worse was how deprived of RPGs Nintendo fans outside of Japan were at the time. Truly a dark day, not just for the disc drive, but even the base N64. After all was said and done, when the console war subsided, Nintendo had lost to Sony by a 3-1 margin. Fumbling Dragon Quest played no small part in that defeat. Taking advantage of the DD's internet functionality, Ramnet discussed 3, guess you could call them, live service games. The first was tentatively titled My Horse Racing Magazine, which they said would partially go live the same month the DD launched. Quote, "You'll become a fictional horse owner and participate in imaginary tournaments while getting the latest horse racing news and information, in an entirely new type of online game." It sounds kind of like fantasy football, where you design a fantasy team, then what happens in a real-life NFL season dictates your team's performance, so winning largely comes down to strategizing and staying on top of the news. Ramnet also said they were planning a digital baseball magazine and digital Formula 1 magazine, which would essentially be the same concept, but for baseball and racing. Users would have had to pay subscriptions for all 3 games. Before we get to more games, let's quickly examine the 64DD online strategy. There were some netplay games, but Nintendo was more focused on functionality that didn't require high-speed internet. Part of their plan was basically an eShop selling smaller DD games, plus a small library of NES, SNES, and Game Boy titles. For bigger DD games, you could watch gameplay videos and pay through your DD, and then they'd send you a physical copy via mail. Every game would also have basically its own subreddit within RandNet, so you could suggest future expansions to the devs or just chit-chat with your fellow fans. Another example was the F-Zero page would have a time trial contest. Gamers could also produce their own content, like selling guides and tips and tricks collections for $1 or $2. This is a change from the old system of feudalism where game companies unilaterally sold software to gamers, explained RandNet president Kayama. It's a kind of democracy. If you want to make money making games in the future, the 64DD is a must-buy. He also alluded to users making in-game content, but the DD died before any of that came to be.
Round 1, fight!
It's easy to forget how dominant Street Fighter was back in the 90s. Street Fighter II was one of Super Nintendo's top 10 bestsellers. In fact, it was 2 of the top 10, only beaten out by Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong. So when fans heard Street Fighter III was coming to 64DD, it was a big deal. Developer Capcom got a disk drive development kit in '97, which was earlier than most other studios, and IGN told its readers to expect Street Fighter as a DD launch title. It never ended up arriving at all, unfortunately, and it took the arcade hit a few years to make it to any console, till finally landing on Dreamcast to rave reviews.
Put your hands together if you wanna clap as we take you through this monkey rap.
As soon as Rare finished up the Donkey Kong Country trilogy on SNES, they immediately got to work on a 64 follow-up. It spent the first year and a half not as a 3D game, but as a side-on adventure. If you've read up on the game's history, you might have heard it referred to as 2.5D. That's really a misnomer though, it was side-on, not a side-scroller. For example, Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze were 2.5D side-scrollers, and direct continuations of the SNES trilogy. But Donkey Kong 64 was not a country game, it actually played more like early builds of Banjo-Kazooie, which looked like this. We talked to Rare artist Carl Tilley, who compared its smaller, more linear stages to Crash Bandicoot. The design was more like side-on Crash, with levels that you play once, he said. I can't remember if we even had many or any collectibles in it at that point either, but eventually we realized the design was lacking and it had no replay value. After Mario 64, free-roaming 3D platformers were seen as the way of the future, so Rare broke up the DK team and brought in some Banjo-Kazooie guys who turned Donkey Kong into another free-roamer. The side-on prototype never got shown to the public, but we've been told some NDAs are expiring soon and screenshots will make their way online probably later this year. Ultra Donkey Kong is on Wikipedia's big list of announced but cancelled disc games, and strangely, it also says the 64DD itself was canned. None of that appears to be true though. For starters, Ultra Donkey Kong was just one of several names made up by the press, derived from the fact that the N64 was originally called the Ultra 64. As for being on DD, sites like GameSpot reported that in '97, saying they heard it from Japanese press. Japanese magazines did have it tagged as a DD game, but in the actual text, they would say things like, will the N64 version be a traditional side-scrolling action game, or an RPG taking advantage of the 64DD's features? They didn't really know anything, because DK64 wasn't even officially mentioned till a year later, and wasn't properly revealed till 6 months after that. It wasn't announced for DD and never developed for it either. Tilly was on the team before and after the breakup, and he told us the game didn't have any specific designs to make use of the 64DD in pre-production, and Rare management wouldn't have wanted to release on the DD. Hardware sales dictated where best to sell the game. In other words, even if DD sales did meet Nintendo's expectations, it only would have sold 1/10 as much as the base console. So even in the best scenario, it never would have made financial sense for Rare to release Donkey Kong 64 on disc. We talked to a couple other devs, who don't recall it ever being meant for DD either. Since we're contradicting common belief, we wanted to be extra certain of this debunking, so we ran this all past DK Vine, a superfan site covering the series since 1999. They were adamant that it was all just rumors and said none of their contact or sources have any memory of it ever being for 64DD. So it is disappointing to find out Nintendo mascots like Donkey Kong, Kirby 64, and Yoshi's Story were never actually disc games despite their inclusion on every DD games list on the internet. It certainly makes the disc drive lose some of its luster, but there's still lots of games that were real, and made clever use of the hardware's unique features, like... Mother 1 and 2 were never huge sellers, but they attracted cult followings with their quirkiness and unique sense of humor. Mother 3, also known as Earthbound 64, was one of the disk system's most promising projects. Unfortunately, it also had one of the most troubled developments. In 1992, series creator Shigesato Itoi said he was making Mother 3 with a Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on. When that add-on got cancelled, development moved over to a standard SNES cart, then later moved over to N64, then to the 64DD, then back to the N64, until ultimately landing on Game Boy Advance in 2006, some 14 years after the project began. It's hard to even say what the game was, since it took so many different forms, so for the sake of brevity, we'll mostly focus on the 64 and DD versions. The team was made up of Itoi's Ape Inc., Iwata's HAL Labs, and even some Pokemon devs. Their plans were ambitious and would have made full use of the disk drive's unique features. Mother 3 was divided into 12 chapters, each with a different protagonist, some adults, some kids, and some non-human. Probably the most recognizable was Lucas, thanks to his role in the Smash Bros. Series. All 12 protagonists live in different places and different times with different motivations. The one thing they do share is all their worlds have a chimera forest, which supernaturally connects all of their disparate strands together. Here's the story from the Space World 99 official guidebook. Quote, "The main characters are a family of 4 with a dog living in a peaceful village. One day, after an unidentified object appears in a nearby cove, strange events start occurring in the village. Then, from the depths of the forest, an unsettling, terrifying scream can be heard. What's happening in those woods? To protect the forest, the village, and his beloved family, the Father Flint ventures into the trees. Here's a strange world that you can't quite decipher between the Middle Ages or the Old West," Itoi explained. And in the end, you realize the circumstances of what made it so strange. It was made in a way that you'd be thinking, this is weird. Then you make it through chapter 11, and hit chapter 12 and scream. Iwata said the 64DD's read-write function was a core theme of Mother 3, letting every player make their own unique impacts on the game world, similar to Zelda 64. He explained that in other games, if you rearrange a room, then leave and come back, it'd be restored to its default state. Any changes you made were gone. But on 64DD, everything would be remembered, making it feel more real, like it was your own. That concept wouldn't just apply to your room, but the entire game. NPCs would remember past conversations so they wouldn't repeat themselves, for example. And thanks to the DD's internal clock, you could do stuff like sow seeds, and 3 real-life days later, they'd sprout. All the DD features were working in unison to make something special. But eventually the disk drive's future started looking bleak, so development switched back to cartridge, which meant losing all those DD features and slimming down the story to only 9 chapters. At one point, the N64 version was roughly half done with a release date in May 2000, but after missing the deadline, Itoi announced Mother 3 was officially cancelled. The big game, once announced as a DD launch title, now wasn't coming out at all. But the story doesn't end there. A few years later, development picked back up on the GBA, with the game finally releasing in 2006 to reviews in the high 8s. Much of the story remained intact, but it got cut down even shorter. Originally it was 12 chapters taking place over a 10-year timeline, but just 8 chapters on GBA, spread over 3 years. The game famously never left Japan, but it didn't take long for fans to put together a high-quality translation of their own. Citing IGN, Wikipedia says after the game got downgraded to N64, there was an expansion disc in the works to add more content called Mother 3.5. Superfan Okeji Dragon asked a Mother designer if that was true in 2011, but he threw cold water on it, saying an expansion might have been an idea at some point, maybe, but they didn't put any actual work into it. And sadly, they never made a Mother 4. Series fans and DD enthusiasts have long dreamed of Mother 3 leaking online, but so far, no such luck. It's unknown how many copies even exist. Fans are aware of one copy in the hands of developer Brownie Brown, but lament there are no other leads to follow. We talked to some former Nintendo of America employees like localizer Jim Warnell, who said some copies came through there too.
We saw quite a few games that would come in for like early demo evaluation. I know we saw early versions of Mother 3. What I saw was just a really rough demo. I think it was the 3 to 4 main characters. From what I saw, it was really rough.
So instead of Japan, the superfans sniffing around for protocards might have more luck talking to devs on this side of the pond. If a build ever does leak, it might come from old NOA staffers. But after all these years, odds seem slim. Earthbound 64 might be the holy grail that forever remains buried, never to be found. Desmond 3D is a game builder for making your own space shooters. Shoot 'em ups. You know, shmups. Similar to Mario Artist and the F-Zero X expansion, this was another one of those build-your-own Disneyland titles that Miyamoto was so enthusiastic about, and ultimately led to games like Mario Maker. Desmond's all about customization, designing your own ships, enemies, stages, and even music. It also comes with tutorials and some pre-built stages so you can understand what Desmond makes possible. You can build entire campaigns, all with mouse support. A cartridge version released in '98 is a Japan exclusive, and was later supposed to get a DD expansion. The cartridge actually contains a hidden message, thanking the debuggers and saying, quote, "We all sincerely hope the 64DD will be released as soon as possible." Little did they know, they still had another year and a half of delays ahead. The unreleased expansion would have used rewritable storage to let you save more levels, 3D models, textures, animations, and music than what was possible on a cartridge, basically by a factor of 10. You could even save multiple campaigns, all on one disc. A shmup editor is a niche product for sure, but back in the 90s it would have been mind-blowing for the right kind of gamer. About a decade ago, the DD expansion disc was acquired and dumped online by a collector called Willis82. You can play it right now if you like, but you won't have much fun if you can't speak Japanese.
I think I singed my hair. All right, easy.
After Mission Impossible set theaters ablaze in summer '96, a video game adaptation was hot on its heels. Originally intended for 16-bit systems, including Super Nintendo, publisher Ocean Software eventually shifted development over to N64. It was announced before the console was even out yet, along with an expansion planned for the 64DD. The disc would add new levels and take multiplayer online. But Ocean was having trouble settling into the 3D era. Early screenshots were too good to be true. Getting those graphics running on anything but PC was literally an impossible mission. And after a year and a half, the team could only get the game running at 4 frames a second. Development hell is probably a fair way to describe it, but we'll keep things short and just say a new team was put in charge, and after some delays, they finally managed to get it to market in 1998, squeezed onto a 12-megabyte cartridge. Those early plans for a disc expansion never came to fruition, with the devs saying, quote, "We haven't had the time to really think about it." And at that point, they were working up to 20 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they didn't even have time to implement multiplayer at all, let alone a deathmatch. A self-described spy simulator, the short campaign followed the same basic premise as the blockbuster film, but plot-wise branched off into new territory. Mission Impossible may have never found its way to DD or measured up to the high expectations set by GoldenEye for that matter, but thanks to the devs' Herculean efforts, the cartridge release turned out to be a decent success, reviewing in the 7s and selling well over 1 million copies, which was pretty good back then.
Tamagotchi, the original virtual reality pet. Your care determines the pets you get from Bandai.
In 1996, Bandai released Tamagotchi into the wild, selling tens of millions. In '97, they quickly followed up with a couple of Tamagotchi Game Boy games, then one on N64 called 64 de Haken. Tamagotchi Mina de Tamagotchi World. It's a board game pretty similar to Mario Party, with occasional mini-games and up to 4 players. We stumbled over a '97 interview where Nintendo executive Hiroshi Imanishi announced that not only was Fire Emblem coming to DD, but that Nintendo and Bandai were also in talks to make a Tamagotchi disc game. Quote, "We're discussing if we can do something interesting on 64DD. Presumably, it would have been more of a virtual pet experience than another board game. But since we were unable to find any more info online or in print, we can't say for sure, and don't know if it entered production or just fizzled out in negotiations." Paper Mario was announced as a DD exclusive in early '97. Originally, it was conceived as a sequel to Super Mario RPG, which had been developed by Square. The sequel was initially called Super Mario RPG 2, and naturally Nintendo asked Square to make this one as well. but Square turned them down because they already had their hands full making Final Fantasy VII. So they hired HAL Labs, the guys who made Earthbound. Then eventually the project landed in the laps of Intelligent Systems, at the time best known for the Fire Emblem franchise. Understandably, them picking up where Square left off was pretty controversial, and a lot of fans didn't think they were up to the task. They'd never made a 3D game before, unless you want to count Fire Emblem 64, which as we said got cancelled because they couldn't hack it. Intelligent Systems buckled down though and separated themselves from Square's offering with a brand new 2.5D aesthetic. By the end, it was no longer a sequel to Mario RPG, not in name, story, or even tone. The name changed to Paper Mario and finally released in late 2000 near the end of the N64's lifecycle, as a cartridge. Everyone loved it, but it only sold about half as many copies as the previous game, making it hard not to wonder how Super Mario RPG 2 might have turned out on disc, especially if Square had stayed in charge. New Japan Pro Wrestling Tokon Road Brave Spirits. Heck of a name. As you might have deduced from the title, it's a Japanese wrestling game that never reached foreign shores. It's based on the real-life New Japan Pro Wrestling League, which was founded in the 70s and still going strong to this day. Tokon Road came out on a cartridge in early '98 with a voiceover recorded at actual matches and a more sophisticated combat system than you typically experience in a wrestling game. Or so they say. Sorry, I'm playing as the red guy here, I don't know the button combinations. The game was a moderate success, and the DD expansion was planned to release in quick succession with more characters, rings, audio, and so on. Wikipedia thinks it got cancelled, but actually it got reworked into a standalone sequel, New Japan Pro Wrestling Tokon Road 2, The Next Generation, which came out less than a year after the first game. Again, only in Japan, but this time on a cartridge almost 3 times the size. Not much else to say about this one, so let's skip ahead to Back in the 90s, Ted Woolsey was a pretty famous localizer who translated games like Mario RPG, Final Fantasy VI, and Chrono Trigger. In '96, he left Square to found his own company called Big Rain, which was quickly bought out by publisher Crave Entertainment, where he stayed on as producer. At this point, Ted started producing 2 RPGs. One was Shadow Madness for PlayStation, which reviewed decently but sold below expectations. The other was for 64DD and codenamed Project Cairo, which Crave said would take full advantage of the hardware. If it was another anime RPG, I don't think we'd be making it, said Crave. We think the art in the game is as good, if not better, than that in Final Fantasy VII. Crave was in contract negotiations to base the game on a major comic book IP, though which one exactly was always kept secret. Cairo was on track to be pretty good, considering Woolsey's pedigree, but it ended up getting cancelled before so much as a screenshot was ever published, and more details, like which comic book it was based on, always remained elusive. We emailed Ted, but never heard back. Then we reached out to a couple dozen devs under his producership, and only got replies from 2 of them. Neither could remember dang near anything from almost 30 years ago. So unfortunately, Project Cairo endures as a big question mark. If any of you all watching this have any leads or worked on it yourself, our Twitter DMs and email are wide open. On the record, off the record, on background, anonymous, however you want to talk, we'll oblige. Though not as well known as it used to be, the Ogre Battle series has one hell of a pedigree. Starting in '93 on the Super Nintendo, you might think it looks a lot like Final Fantasy Tactics, but actually it's the other way around. Ogre came out first, then its creator left Quest Corporation for Squaresoft, and made Tactics as a spiritual successor. When that happened, Quest ventured out to make an Ogre sequel without him. There's some question online if it was ever actually intended for Nintendo's disk drive, but we managed to find confirmation in an issue of 64 Dream. Quote, Quest has announced they're developing an RPG exclusively for 64DD. We still don't know if the 64DD will sell or not, but the discerning Quest is going for it. Well, maybe they weren't that discerning. The DD did end up a failure after all. But Quest needed the extra storage only a disc could offer. Like many other DD games, the hardware's repeated delays ultimately pushed them to a standard N64 release, this time onto a 40MB cartridge, which made it the biggest N64 game ever released at the time. And even on card, it managed to be one of the longest, fighting your way through 50 hours of Civil War with 3 possible endings. Ogre Battle was published by Nintendo and finally released in '99, proving Quest still had the magic even after losing its creator. The game pulled in 9s like it was nothing, and is still considered one of the best real-time tactical RPGs of all time. Interestingly, the Nintendo GigaLeak revealed the cartridge was coded to get a disc expansion until pretty late in development, meaning after it was downgraded to cart, Quest was still planning an additional disc. But code support was deleted prior to release, so the expansion never came out. We're going to talk about Pokemon RPG here in a minute, but for full context, first you need some backstory on Pokemon Snap. It all started in early 1995, a year before the first Pokemon Game Boy games released in Japan. Miyamoto, Iwata, and Itoy were talking about how rough devs had it at other companies, getting overworked just to crank out crap games. So they went to Nintendo president Yamauchi and said, why don't we hire some of these guys and give them complete freedom to make whatever they want for 64DD, with no deadlines. Surely they'll cook up something incredible. Yamauchi was an open-minded guy, so he said, yeah, let's do it. They named the new studio Jack and Beans and put out an ad calling all developers. It said, talent is like a seed. Watered properly, it'll sprout and grow as high as the heavens. But some seeds are neglected, buried, and can't grow. What a waste. Come with us, little seeds. We'll give you soil and water. Nintendo's new 64-bit machine awaits. Then it revealed Jack and Beans was led by legends like Miyamoto, Iwata, and Itoy. 550 devs showed up, and Nintendo picked the best 11. They were all elated to have gotten picked. But when they arrived for their first day of work, they were surprised to find their new office was tiny with hardly anything in it. Until recently, it had been Nintendo's ping pong room. Iwata handed them an envelope stuffed with cash. Here's $4,000, he said. Miyamoto told them, make something that's never been done before. And they left. The big guys were thinking, oh man, I wish we had it this good when we were young. No managers breathing down our necks, no deadlines, total freedom. But in reality, those 11 devs were terrified. They didn't know how to make something never done before. They spent the $4,000 on a TV, refrigerator, and some cabinets. There was minimal leadership from the big guys. They were too busy with other projects like Cabbage, Mother, and Mario. No one was put in charge, so the Jack guys wandered aimlessly for months till they eventually started making a game about taking pictures. That was an original idea, they thought. And DD discs have lots of writable storage which could be used for saving tons of pictures. Wikipedia and other sites say at this point the game was literally based on Jack and the Beanstalk, but actually that was just the inspirational recruitment ad. Truth is, it doesn't seem like the game had much of a plot, or even a name. Even the guys making it thought it sucked. There wasn't any motivation for the player to take pictures or any rewards for doing so. They scrapped it and restarted several times, and even after all that, the team said it didn't even feel like a game. After a couple of years, Pokemon was exploding in popularity, and the anime had just debuted. So Nintendo mixed things up by making Pokemon the thing players take pictures of. Some of the Jack guys didn't like that idea, but it ultimately gave them some direction. Originally, the player wandered around on foot, but after experimenting with an on-rail system in certain areas, Miyamoto told them to make the entire game on rails. They also added Professor Oak, who grades your pictures and gives you points, thus providing a sense of progression. The third game changer was letting players print out their pictures and share them with friends, which got fans connecting in real life, similar to the Pokemon Game Boy games. The team finally felt like they had a game on their hands. Late in development, it switched from disc to cart because they wanted to release it to line up with the first Pokemon movie. And also so they could launch before Gold and Silver came out, otherwise it'd make Snap look bad for not including any Gen 2 Pokemon. One of the main selling points in previews was being able to save all of your photos. In fact, disc's writable storage was why they made the camera game in the first place. But after switching to cart, there was only enough storage to save 60 photos, not even enough for one picture of each Pokemon, which sort of undermined the game's original premise. Not to mention it only had 6 levels. Start to finish, the whole process lasted over 4 years and really soured Nintendo's belief in giving devs total freedom and no deadlines. Fortunately, things turned out okay. Pokemon Snap finally released in spring '99 to decent reviews and a few million sales. Not a lot by Pokemon standards, but enough to keep the lights on in the ping pong room. That was a pretty long history on Pokemon Snap, but it was necessary context to better understand another game on Wikipedia's canceled disc games list, Pokemon RPG. In '98, IGN reported a game codenamed Pokemon DD was in development, and speculated it'd play like the Game Boy games. That speculation got spread as fact by folks like Lost Media Wiki, who said it was going to be the series' first console RPG. As we've already discussed, websites like IGN got a lot of their information from Japanese magazines. Digging through them now, we found those magazines were talking about a Pokemon RPG for DD back then. They don't have many details, though there was plenty of speculation, like maybe it'd come out as multiple colors like the Game Boy games. Or there'll be additional discs that add more forests and towns, which sounds awesome, but we couldn't find any statements from Nintendo backing any of that up. We did find an interesting interview from Miyamoto though, in summer '97. When asked about Pokemon coming to the disc drive, he says, "For now, we plan to release 2 kinds of Pokemon game. One will be an entirely different genre from an RPG. That one will release first." The interviewer asks when. He says it'll be a DD launch title, but can't give away any details until the next Space World. With what we know now in the future, Miyamoto was clearly referring to Pokemon Stadium. Next, the interviewer asks, and what's the state of the other one, the Pokemon RPG? Miyamoto, well, right now, we currently have 10 staff members working on the Pokemon RPG, but we plan to add another 20 people soon. End quote. This interview took place about 2 months after Jack and Bean's camera game was transformed into Pokemon Snap. At the time, you could run around freely, and what the game was exactly was constantly in flux. So it's understandable that when the interviewer called it an RPG, Miyamoto didn't say boo, especially since he didn't want to spill the beans until Space World. More revealing is when he said the RPG has 10 staff members. We know the Jack team was 11 guys, and 1 quit in the middle due to the troubled development. That makes 10. Miyamoto also says they're going to add 20 more. Pokemon Snap's credits, if you subtract the producers, localizers, and voice actors, and just account for the core team, shows a staff of 34. The math all adds up. The RPG was Pokemon Snap. After Snap officially revealed, Pokemon RPG was replaced with Pokemon Snap on Japanese magazine's upcoming game lists, with its genre switched from RPG to ETC. Meanwhile, in the English-speaking world, IGN kept on reporting that Stadium, Snap, and Pokemon RPG were all different projects. But Miyamoto said there were 2 DD games in development, not 3. Nintendo said that all along, even before the Miyamoto interview. 2 3D Pokemon games for 64DD, which were revealed as Stadium and Snap in early '98. But before their official titles were revealed, both were referred to as Pokemon 64 and Pokemon DD interchangeably, which confused 90s journalists. There was also a 3rd game, Hey You Pikachu for N64, confusing things even worse. For about a year, Nintendo was constantly teasing these games to build up hype and sell consoles, while trying not to reveal too much before their official reveals. Even for us, with the benefits of hindsight and modern internet, sorting through all this mess was still confusing as hell. But after translating hundreds of pages of Pokemon primary sources over the past few years, it's clear that Pokemon RPG was born from vague statements about multiple titles and combined into one imaginary game fans wanted to exist. DidYouKnowGaming's not innocent in all this either. We spread the Pokemon RPG rumor too in a video 5 years ago.
In a 1998 IGN article, the site listed 4 upcoming Pokemon N64 games: Pokemon RPG, Hey You Pikachu, Pokemon Snap, and Pokemon Stadium, implying Pokemon RPG was an entirely different game than Stadium, despite both being turn-based. It's thought the game would have been in line with the main Pokemon series, but for home consoles. The only first-hand mention of it was in a 1997 interview with Miyamoto, conducted by Electronic Gaming Monthly. When asked about the game's progress, he said 10 people were currently working on the game, and that while it was planned to come out in Japan, a US release was still up in the air.
Miyamoto was actually talking about Stadium 1 in that interview, which was indeed slated as a DD launch title at the time, and only came out in Japan. That's our bad. We should have dug deeper into primary sources back then instead of repeating surface-level internet info. Our sincerest apologies. We could spend another 10 minutes dissecting interviews and connecting dots, but I think we've made our point. To wrap all this up, Wikipedia says there are 5 cancelled DD Pokemon games. The Stadium expansion disc and Stadium 2 are the same thing though, so we'll cross one off the list. And we're going to cross Pokemon RPG off too. There were only 3 DD Pokemon games, plus 1 more if you count Stadium Gold and Silver, all of which released on cartridge. Okay, with all of that debunked, let's move on to some games that did exist. Super Robot Wars 64 is set 200 years after a population crisis that pushed most of humanity fleeing to space. The ruling class stayed planetside to govern the space colonies but grew ever more oppressive with the passage of time. Eventually, Earth and the colonies went to war, resulting in half the underclass getting wiped out. But in the ashes of their conflict, an alien empire shows up to conquer what's left. The player takes control of resistance fighters. That's the story. Gameplay-wise, it's a grid-based strategy RPG similar to Fire Emblem, but based in science fiction. The campaign's pretty long, with 124 playable missions, though a lot of them are optional side quests. The game also made use of the transfer pack, which let you link up with a Game Boy entry to unlock additional characters and equipment. Super Robot Wars got good reviews when it came out in late '99, but sadly never left Japan. It's actually part of a long-running series that started in the early 90s on Game Boy, and continued into the present with over 50 sequels that cross over with famous mech franchises, like Gundam and Neon Genesis Evangelion. Just a few weeks ago, a Japanese N64 enthusiast called Neko Kabu discovered internal code inside Wars 64, revealing the devs tried to make the cartridge release compatible with a 64DD expansion, presumably for additional content, like missions, characters, and equipment, but there's not enough in the code to determine what the disc expansion would have done exactly. Likewise, it's unclear if an expansion was planned out or merely considered. Shogi is basically Japanese chess. Though it was originally brought from China to Japan in the 700s, modern shogi is only about 400 years old. It's a strategy game for 2 players and still popular in the land of the rising sun to this day. Morita Shogi 64 was announced for the 64DD, but ended up releasing on cartridge instead. Or at least, that's what it says on Wikipedia. But that doesn't make any sense, since Morita Shogi 64 released in early '98, while Shogi DD was announced in late '99. Both contradicting sources are cited by Wikipedia. What really happened is Seta Corporation made one shogi game as a launch title in '96, and then another in '98 with a modem connection port built into the cartridge. Plug in your landline cord and you can play other shogi heads over the internet. The only N64 game ever made like that. Then a year and a half later, Nintendo announced another game simply called Shogi. Other than that tentative title, there were 0 details, like who was making it or how it would have improved on the cartridge release. We did, however, find an interview with Seta Corporation CEO, where he discussed ideas for a potential shogi DD. In short, if the computer loses, it analyzes how it lost, he said. Then it learns, so the next time it faces the player, it won't fall for the same tricks. The difference, from the N64 version, is it learns from the player, and the game itself changes. I want to make this sort of, let's call it an automatic rewrite algorithm, to alter its own strategies little by little." End quote. In that regard, it'd be similar to Iwata's algorithm for Cabbage, using the DD's rewrite function to produce and save a self-learning AI. There's no proof that this was the same shogi that Nintendo announced was coming to the disk drive, but it seems likely, especially since Seta had already made 2 shogis, the second of which had netplay, and AI was their plan to move things forward with the disk iteration. On a side note, it's worth mentioning that N64 hacker Zoinkitty recently discovered unique code in another N64 shogi game. Yes, there were 4 of them. That suggests it was originally developed for 64DD before moving to cartridge. That game, called AI Shogi 3, was made by i4 Corporation and released in '98 though, so it's definitely not the cancelled DD shogi that Nintendo announced in late '99. Ide Yuzuki is a celebrity mahjong player in Japan. Remember all of those Brain Age games where the real-life neuroscientist Dr. Kawashima kept your mind from aging like mush? Ide Yuzuki is like that guy, but for mahjong, the 4-player board game invented in China 200 years ago. In addition to playing professionally, Ide also starred in some video games. Ide Yuzuki's Master Mahjong for Nintendo Famicom, Ide Yuzuki's Mahjong Classroom for PlayStation, and lots more from 3DO to Wii. He was going to have a DD game too, called Ide Yuzuki's Mahjong School. Primarily aimed at beginners, the campaign mode put you in the shoes of a lodger living with the Murakama family who love mahjong. There were also a few other characters too, most notably Lisa the American exchange student, and Master Ide himself. You could play in tournaments, or just choose opponents you vibe with for free play. They all have backstories, make conversation, and part of the fun was reading their vocal and facial expressions, which you could use to inform your strategy. Outside of the main campaign, there was another mode for observing games from a real-life championship, with the benefit of Master Ide's commentary. At any point, you could push a button and take over one side of the game yourself, if you have the stones to challenge the pros. You could also play friends online and access other online features. Unfortunately, during development, Ide's Mahjong School got downgraded to a standard cartridge, then later canceled completely. Or at least that's what it says on Wikipedia. Truth is, it did come out in 2000. Mahjong wasn't as lucky as Shogi though, which got that modem connection port built into the cartridge. No more online features for Ide, sadly. Like DT Blood Masters and Derby Stallion, Mahjong would have let 4 players plug in their Game Boys to use as controllers with screens, but that didn't make it in either. And of course, the final release was only in Japan, which is a shame, since it would have been good for gaijin who want to learn Mahjong. Mario Party came out in '98, followed up a year later with Mario Party 2, adding new boards and minigames. The internal code reveals the second game was actually intended as a disc expansion for the first, which is reflected on screen if you boot up Mario Party 1 with a random disc in the DD. The intro cutscene gets interrupted with an error saying to insert the correct disc, which doesn't happen with other N64 games, except the ones programmed to get expansions, like F-Zero and Ocarina of Time. In an alternate timeline where the DD released sooner like it was supposed to, and Party 2 was released on disc like it was supposed to, Mario Party 3 presumably would have been an expansion as well. From a technical perspective, it was indeed possible for one game to get multiple disc expansions. Both sequels came out on cartridge anyway, so it's not like we're missing out on content. We are missing out on money though, since carts typically sold for $60 and discs were $20 or $30. Now, I'm not butthurt about a few dollars all these years later, but it is an interesting footnote in DD history. And after that precedent was set, it'd be interesting to see how Nintendo handled the dozen sequels that came after. Wikipedia's list has one entry that's baffled us for months, simply labeled Namco RPG. Looking into it a bit further, it was reportedly part of the Tales series, which used to be one of the best-selling RPG series, earning itself about 20 sequels. The first game, Tales of Fantasia, came out on Super Nintendo in '95. A year later, a Namco spokesman told IGN a sequel was coming to DD in just a few months, implying the game's development was almost complete. At that time, Namco was expecting the DD was going to release soon. It didn't though, and Tales DD was never mentioned again. Namco did, however, reveal a new Tales game for PlayStation 6 months later, called Tales of Destiny. Initially, we thought Namco must have ported it from DD to PlayStation when they realized the DD wasn't launching as soon as they thought. But then we saw design documents proving Destiny was always meant for the PlayStation. Early Tales games were made by the same team, so it seems unlikely Namco had a second team making another, unique Tales for Nintendo. Possibly they were going to dual release Destiny on PS1 and 64DD, but that doesn't seem likely either, and the game's code doesn't suggest that was happening. The only other possibility is that Namco announced a fake game. But that doesn't make any sense, especially since they announced a sports game in that same interview which did come to N64 in '97, just as they said it would. Frankly, we're at our wits' end with this one. What was Tales 64DD? There's no details online, and all we could find in print was a Japanese blurb saying Namco's making a DD RPG, but quote, no information at all, just that it's being made. We tried to get a hold of the devs, but they didn't want to talk. We reached out to that Namco spokesman, but he never got back to us. We worked with fan group Life Bottle Productions trying to get to the bottom of this mysterious Tales game, and even with their rare interviews and knowledge of the code, they were just as baffled as we were. So in a similar case as Project Cairo, we just gotta throw up our hands and admit defeat. If you have any inside info or leads, you know where to find us. And now our final disc game. There's one easily overlooked, very boring sounding title on Wikipedia's list. It just says Communication Game, from the makers of PostPet, an email application. We looked and looked, but couldn't find any more details online or in print. We weren't sure if the game was even real. Nintendo also used the term communication game for Animal Crossing though. So we were curious, and reached out to Kazuhiko Hachiya, the creator of PostPet and presumed director of this communication game. And he told us yes, the project was real. It was a Marigold management game, just like DT Bloodmasters, Derby Stallion, and Cubivore. But the project ended midway through development for, quote, various reasons. We asked what the game was exactly, but apparently 25 years later, it's still a secret. As boring as Communication Game appears at a passing glance, we think it might have been more than it appears. Because while we don't know much about the canceled project, we do know a lot about Hachiya. We'll give you a quick rundown. In the mid-90s, email was a relatively new concept.
Email, or electronic mail, is a way of sending messages to someone computer to computer.
Hachiya's girlfriend didn't want to use email. She found it cold and complicated. So he made a little program where silly animals delivered emails for her. She loved it, and Hachiya hired a few friends to turn it into a full-fledged product called PostPet, the least efficient, most charming email inbox of all time. The way it works is PostPets hang out in your inbox, eating, dancing, using the litter box, and so on. When you want to send an email, a PostPet will grab it and disappear off screen, then appear on your friend's computer to deliver your message. Then they'll stay there for a while, demanding to be fed and pet, playing with their PostPets, and keeping a diary of how your friend treats them. When your friend emails you back, your PostPet will take it and come back home and tell you how it was treated. If it was treated poorly, it might not want to deliver any more emails to that person. Or maybe they'll just tear the email to shreds. On the other hand, if it was given food and love, it might start writing your friend emails all on its own. We could go on and on about how PostPet worked, but you get the idea. It was a huge hit and millions of Japanese people used PostPet instead of a regular email account. Hachiya got rich, but refused venture capital so he could keep his team small, and always aimed to do the opposite of what Silicon Valley does. New versions of PostPet are still being made today, vastly expanding on the original. Most notably a Nintendo DS version developed by Alpha Dream, the same studio that made the Mario and Luigi games. In the 90s, Hachiya also invented a jet-fueled skateboard based on Back to the Future, and tried to invent a TV telephone that fly itself to people you want to talk to. But he had more success recreating the fictional Maui aircraft from the Miyazaki film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Here's Hachiya flying it himself a few years ago. He's also still a huge 90s gamer. To this day, he calls himself an N64 fundamentalist. He's got one of the few 64 DDs in existence and still plays its games, like F-Zero and Doshin the Giant. He's a big Pikmin fan as well, and likes playing the new one on his Switch. So that's to say, whatever he was cooking up for the disk drive, it no doubt would have been imaginative. Possibly we're overthinking it, and Communication Game was just an intra-DD post-pet messaging system. But Marigold's involvement, the secrecy, and Hachiya's eccentricity leads us to believe it was more than that. Besides, the DD already had an email system built into RandNet. Maybe like PostPets and Animal Crossing, it could have become a huge franchise continuing into the present. Or perhaps just a one-off cult classic. Either way, it's a shame we'll never get to play it. And that brings us to the end of our list of 64 disk drive titles. By our count, we've covered 31 canceled new games, 9 expansions, and 3 ports. Another 13 games got downgraded to N64 carts, 3 were pushed to GameCube, and 4 jumped ship to competing consoles. Some lines are admittedly a little blurry, like with Simcopter 64 a port because it's based on a PC release, or a new game since it was getting completely reimagined. There's certainly room for debate, but we've categorized and tracked down sources to the best of our abilities. Though as we said before, we're not infallible, and there's undoubtedly information and entire projects we couldn't find. It's also worth noting that even the 9 games that did release were arguably incomplete. RANNet President Kayama said we could expect Japan Pro Golf Tour to get more post-release courses like Augusta and St. Andrews. Miyamoto talked about additional discs providing Crazy Taxi and other experiences within SimCity. The repeated delays and ultimate failure of the 64DD was tragic. We basically missed out on half of a Nintendo console generation. Some of its ideas were reinterpreted in the future, but others got buried in the 90s forever, lost to time. Did you also know Rare was making sequels to Conker's Bad Fur Day and Diddy Kong Racing, but they got cancelled around their Microsoft buyout in 2002? If you want to hear about every cancelled GameCube game, click the video on screen. Hey, I'm Tony from Hard for Games. I've been making 64DD videos on my own channel for about 15 years now. If you want to see some, click the playlist on the right. Special thanks to our translator Jacob, DD hardware consultant and proofreader LuigiBlood, and the superfans who helped us investigate individual games, like DK Vine, Life Bottle Productions, Cody Nicolo from Mother Forever, and Bulbapedia administrator Snorlax Monster. And thank you for watching. See you next time.